earthworms. I'm excited to introduce tonight's presenter, Josef Gorres. Josef is a soils professor at the University of Vermont. His teaching and research connect ecosystem services with agricultural economics for the sustainability and prosperity of farms in Vermont. Please welcome me and joining Josef.
Thank you. All right, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we're off. Oh, I have to choose the screen now. Again, hang on a sec. There you go. I hope that you see what I hope you see. You should see something that says invasive earthworms, second wave. What do we know? Perfect. Thank you. So I should add to this that even though this is sort of my hobby, because it's not really what I get paid for, I mean the invasive earthworms, it's become a big part of my life anyway. So it's pretty crazy. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to introduce you to earthworms a little bit, earthworms in this region, before I get to the second wave. So first, what about earthworms? And with a bit of luck, I can move this. Oh, come on. There you go, went too fast. So first I had some fun facts. I always get this question, predator avoidance, why do earthworms come out in a rainstorm? So the first thing that you hear is that it might be predator avoidance. So as the rain is hitting the ground, it sets up vibrations. The vibrations are very similar to what below ground predators do, like voles and moles that move through the soil, and so the worms escape from the soil so they can avoid the predator. That's one explanation, but the other explanation is that at the surface, the opportunity for other things are much greater, right? So once it rains and it's a wet surface, that surface is now habitable for the earthworm that like to be in moist environments, and so they can mate, they can migrate, and they can search for food. So the second one is probably the more important one than the first one. And you may wonder how many earthworm species there are. So there's 4,000 described species, and they're in 25 different families, and 24 of those species, probably more than that, are in New England. And so in Vermont, we're getting close to that 24 number as we are finding more and more earthworms. There's an estimate that there's about 8,000 species, but half of them have not been described, or they're cryptic species. So cryptic species are things where there's two species that look exactly the same, but when you look at the genetics of those species, they're very different, and then you kind of have to cast them as two separate species. So there's different earthworm species, obviously, and they all look the same to you, right? They may also look the same to me, but there's really there's quite a bit of variation in earthworms if you really look closely. And so there's earthworm A is a night crawler. Earthworm B is a red worm, which is closely related to the night crawler. So it's not a red wiggler, it's a red worm. Then species C is a Malaysian blue. It's a composting worm that is also found in some composting beds here in Vermont. And they sneak in because the composting trade, vermicomposting trade, is not so good at understanding or knowing what is in their worm bin. So these worms are either being sold, and there's impurities in there. So if you buy a bunch of red wigglers, you have a good chance of getting one of these Malaysian worms as well, Malaysian blues. And then D is one of the snake worms. So this is what we're going to talk about. The second wave of earthworm invasions in the Northeast are these snake worms, jumping worms. There's different names for them. The technical term that people prefer is ferritemoid or ferritemoid. And that comes basically from an old genus that is now defunct. These worms are so crazy, so genetically and and morphologically crazy that they keep being reassigned to different genera, and species names change, and there's also weird stuff going on with them all the time. So we stick to two terms, snakeworms or ferritomoids in this talk. And there's keys for most earthworms. So the European invaders can be, most of them can be found on this key. And it's pretty simple, you know, look at how big is the worm, small, medium, large, and there's the things that 2 inches is small, between 2 and 4 is medium, and greater than 4 inches are large worms. And then once you know how big they are, you kind of look at the color of them, and then eventually you come down to the minutiae of you know, you look, most of the time you look at the underside of the worm where the clitellum is. The clitellum is that ring that goes around the worm, and that can tell you a lot for the European earthworms, the first wave of the invasion. So don't be fooled. The European earthworms also weren't here, you know, after glaciation, so they're also invaders. And there is also some damage associated with those worms, and we'll see a couple of things in a minute. So there are keys, and so this is key to the reproductively mature earthworms in Canada. And by reproductively mature, we mean that they have a clitellum. So when they're juveniles, they don't have that ring around the collar. And the deal with that is you cannot tell what that worm is unless there's other markings that are very clear. And in most cases, there aren't. So you can go by the color go by the color, maybe not by the size, because juveniles are smaller than the grown worms. But by the color, you can probably classify them at least into one type of earthworm or another type of earthworm. First wave, European earthworms. They're in the family of Lumbricidae. And a good example of that is, what the largest example here in the northeast of an earthworm in that family is the nightcrawler. It's basically the biggest worm that you'll find in Vermont. So Lumbricus terrestris is the name. And it has a couple of really interesting features. One is that it has this really dark head, and then the rest of the body is slightly lighter. And in this case, you probably notice that tail is flared, and that is a typical it's a typical adaptation that nightcrawlers have, and any of the other worms that are in the same genus, not the same family but the same genus, will do this. They flare their tails when they're touched. And so the nightcrawler makes permanent burrows, and so when the nightcrawler is sticking its head out, and a predator comes along and tries to pull it out, it kind of flares out its tail. So sometimes the nightcrawler is also known as beaver tail, because it's got this flat tail when you touch it. So one of the questions that everybody's asking, why are earthworms so successful? And you know, in the Northeast, the answer is relatively easy. It's because after the Ice Age, there was a whole region north of the glacial boundary that was devoid of earthworms. So this is prime territory for earthworms to go and fill a niche, ecological niche. So there's that picture, extent of glass glaciation, no to few native earthworms in that blue area, so north of the last glaciation, the extent of the last glaciation. It doesn't mean that there is no earthworms south of that glaciation. So there's native North American worms, and you find a lot of them south of that boundary. However, there's also in recent years, people have found a few North American worms north of that boundary. So there are some. They're very, very rare, so you don't find them that much. You find a lot more European earthworms than you do North American earthworms north of the glaciation. South of that, you also have a mix of, there you have a mix of native and invasive or exotic earthworms. and the European worms for sure, and the Asian earthworms can become dominant in those communities. What you see there on this slide, in addition to that map, are a few ways that earthworms move around. So on the bottom left-hand side of the slide, you see a vermicomposting operation. And so vermicomposters can move these things around, and you will see a slide later on where jumping worms or snake worms are being sold on the internet for composting purposes, and we'll get to that in a minute. Well, actually, in about 20 minutes. Then bait, of course, is another way that some of these worms move around, and then horticulture is a huge driver of the invasion from the nursery out to the community. So the second wave, that's what we're going to talk about today mainly, is it's Asian earthworms, and they're in the family of Megascolecidae. And one of the examples of that is the crazy snakeworm, which is, there's three species here in Vermont. One of them is Amynthus agrestis, and that's what that picture is of. And I would like to point out that these worms are actually pretty attractive. They have like speed stripes, so it's little, when the sun is shining on them just right, you see these beautiful bands of color, rainbow colors. It also has a clitellum. In this case, this is an adult. And that clitellum, unlike in European species, it goes all the way around the worm. There's no break. The European worms have saddles rather than annular or ring clitella. And so that's one of the ways that you can distinguish the European worms from the Asian worms. Okay, so the other way that you can tell them is by looking at how they move. So they move like snakes, hence snakeworm. The other thing that you see here is are their castings. The castings that they make are very loose compared to European worms. They're really loose, and they make usually a thick layer of this. They can be up to 15 centimeters, so 6 inches deep. They are also very erodible. So if this happens on a slope, then you can expect that there is some erosion going on if there's no leaf cover or there's no canopy that would break the energy of the rainstorm. So their behavior is also giveaway, and these castings are giveaways of their presence. All right, number of earthworm species in Vermont. The more you look, the more you find. So every year I adjust this slide and I strike things out. So when I first started looking, there was 16 species, and this year we're up to 20. European species that are here is, there are now 14 recognized European species in Vermont. And you notice that went up at some point and then came down again. And that's really interesting because it came down from 15 because one of the species was reclassified as a North American species. And so that number went down, and if you look down at the bottom there, it says confirmed North American species went up from 1 to 2. And that's what that is. So, with genetic analyses, a lot of things are shifting. But the North American worms are really rare. There's 4 confirmed Asian species. So Amynthus agrestis, Amynthus tokiensis, Amynthus hilgendorfi, and then there's Perionyx excavatus. And that is that Malaysian blue that I showed you a picture of. And so it's a slightly different one. People think that it does not survive the winters. Certainly as a worm it doesn't, but these worms also have these things called cocoons, which are egg casings. And most earthworms that have egg casings, they all have egg casings, but most earthworm egg casings are cold or freeze resistant. And we get to that also in a minute. So I don't really want to say that Perionyx excavatus would not survive the winter in Vermont. I think it probably can. So the biogeography of phragmoids, what is their range? Where do you find them? So in the original range is Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and maybe some Burma. So some of the Asian countries you find them. But the main source of the earthworms, the Asian earthworms that we have here in Vermont, are Japan and Korea. Canada, there's only been one report of snakeworms in Canada, and that's from the most southern part of Ontario. Otherwise, in the US, reported from 37 different states, and there's 16 phragmoid or snakeworm species in north of Mexico, in America. So you want to know how did they get here? And there's probably two big introductions or original introductions that might have happened. So one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And so I'm going to first talk about the one on the East Coast. So the story goes that at some point Japan wanted to please Mrs. Taft, and they sent 2,000 cherry trees to DC, and it just so happened that those cherry trees, they were still in soil, because that's the way they were doing things in those days. There wasn't any soilless horticulture going on at that point. But so 2,000 trees were sent in 1910, and the story goes, well, they did not sterilize the soil. They didn't fumigate the trees and the soil, and so after they were planted, they were ripped out of the ground and replaced by 3,000 more. And so people think that in 1912, the first of those ferretimoid or snakeworms arrived on the East Coast with these cherry trees. And the reason why people think that is because around that period of time, people first saw them on the Johns Hopkins campus. So I think people thought that, they had been traveling on the heels of whatever, horticulture or something like that, and got to Baltimore as well. When were they first reported in most of the states? So California, so this is now we're talking about the West Coast. There was 4 species that have been reported between 1860 to 1950. And so that 1860 precedes the introduction on the East Coast. And it's Pacific Rim, so there might have been some trade, maybe the time that Commander Perry opened Japan up, there might have been some trade going on shortly after that in 1854, and that might have brought some of these species over. And it's interesting because California has an Asian earthworm that was first described in California, and it's Amynthus californicus, and it's really kind of cute because why California is always first on something, right? So. But Connecticut has 5 species, Delaware has 3 species, DC only 1 species described in 1937. I'm sure there's more species there, but who's looking? Florida has 13 species discovered between 1950 and 2010. And if you go all the way down to Vermont, there's 3 species that were discovered in 2011 and 2012. And by discovered, I mean that somebody described them. It wasn't that they weren't there, and it wasn't that somebody else had seen them. It's like Livingston going to the Victoria Falls and saying, "I discovered the Victoria Falls." Yeah, no. So Vermont, we reckon that by what horticulturists tell us, that they were here in the 1990s at least. So maybe even earlier than that. So how do they spread now? Well, horticulture is a big thing. So they move with plants that are sold in pots or maybe with the root balls of trees. So I know that there's a few tree nurseries that have them, and they kind of sell them sell the trees with the soil to be planted in cities, so that they are basically tree nurseries for Burlington, for example, where the root balls are infected by these. Other ways, on a smaller scale, you have plant exchanges to plant clubs or with family or friends. You say, "Oh, I've got a lovely pot plant. You should really have that. Let me give you this from my garden." And the pot has these worms in them. And if the worms are not in there, then their cocoons might be in there. So if you have them in the garden, most likely you will move them if you give a pot or a plant, or you dig a plant out and you give it to a friend. So if you have to exchange with bare roots, really important. So that's one way that these things move around. Here's that vermicomposting slide that I talked to you about. So this website is selling Alabama jumpers, which are Amynthas agrestis, potentially another species as well. So because earthworms all look the same, there's several species that have the same common name, right? So be aware of that. This says here, the Alabama jumper is native to Asia. However, it now populates large sections of North America, true, where the jumper is used as bait worm, vermicomposting, released into gardens to improve garden soil. Sometimes they are called Asian jumpers, garden worms. So it goes on to say how great these worms are. And then there's this update, and it says environmental concerns of Alabama jumper. It should be noted that the Alabama jumper is surrounded by some controversy. Not that this is like a really important thing, it's just there's some controversy. And the National Park Service feels that jumpers released into the wild pose a serious threat to the ecosystem, but that's the federal government, so don't worry about it, right? So what do they know? Researchers allege jumpers consume natural leaf litter carpet in woodlands that other invertebrates feed on to survive. In turn, this eliminates the food supply, blah, blah, blah. The allegation continues to imply that the Alabama jumper seriously interrupts the natural food chain and its most critical level. So they have this thing in there. So it's on you if you buy this. It's not our fault. We told you about it, even though the wording is a little weak. In reality, there is always debate about how the introduction of a worm breed to new areas, may impact local ecosystem. In other words, is a species invasive to the point of causing damage? Good question, right? So anyway, so where are we at with in the eastern USA and Canada in terms of their distribution? They're pretty much all along the East Coast, and then also into the western part of the eastern part of the Midwest. So they have been described as far as Minnesota, Wisconsin, but also all the way down to Florida. I said there was 13 species there, so the world record of American ferritomoid species. And if you look at this map, you notice that there's clusters, and those clusters are essentially research institutions that have some kind of research going on these worms, so they find them. It doesn't mean that South Carolina or North Carolina doesn't have them. It just means that nobody's looking there. So these clusters here up in Vermont, that's me. The clusters down in Massachusetts, I'm not sure who that is, but they might come up for other reasons. Then there's a cluster in center of New York that is Colgate University. Wisconsin and Madison has a program. Then there's people working on it in Baltimore. So all this over here is the Baltimore group. And then there's a whole bunch of places where people have looked and found them and reported them through some web portal. So in Vermont, if you look at this, there's really only two. This was a while ago. There was only two places that hadn't reported them, two counties hadn't reported them. But I think we have one now in Orleans County, so they're up there as well. And I'm sure if we really look closely at some of the nurseries and gardens in Essex County, we'll probably find them there too. So in the Northeast, we have 3 species that co-invade. They usually turn up in the same place. You notice that there's this thing that says hat. Those stand for three species. Amynthus tokiensis is the T, Amynthus agrestis is the A, and Metaphia hilgendorfi is the H. And so if you see hat in colors, then all 3 of them are there. If there's a white entry, then that means at that site they were not found. Amynthus tokiensis is the smallest one here in Vermont. Amynthus agrestis is a little larger, and Metaphia hilgendorfi is the largest one of these snake worms. So this is interesting because if you go to Japan, I went to Japan to collect some of these earthworms a couple of years back, and if you go there, you say, oh, I can tell these things apart because one is smaller than the other. No, not in Japan. In Japan, Amynthus tokiensis and Amynthus agrestis are the same range of size. You just can't tell by the size. You really have to look at all the bits and pieces to be able to tell them apart. So you can't be fooled by that. There's something going on in Vermont. Maybe the food is just not right for Amynthus tokiensis to grow any bigger. So you may also want to ask, why are they so invasive other than what we said about there was no earthworms in the formerly glaciated Northeast? They're parthenogen. So parthenogenesis means that they don't need a friend to make babies or lay cocoons. They will have viable cocoons even though they didn't have sex. So you don't need more than one of these earthworms to start a colony. And they can produce, each one of these worms can produce about 60 cocoons a year. And that's quite a bit. So the following year, it's 60 times 60. You can figure out how quickly that mushrooms. The other thing that's important is they're really voracious. So they can take in full season's worth of leaf litter in a few months. And that basically deprives some of the other earthworms that might have been there, the European earthworms, of their food. I find European earthworms and Asian earthworms in the same compost pile here in my garden. And if you look at other compost piles around the state, it's the same thing. As long as there's a lot of resources available, you have coexistence between them. If you're in a forest, like a deciduous forest, where you have 1 year's worth of leaf litter, these worms will just take care of the leaf litter and don't leave anything for the European worms, and therefore, so this is a hypothesis, I haven't proved that at all, but I think that's probably pretty true for the worms that we have up here. The snake worms will just outcompete the European worms. The other reason why they're really probably successful is because the annual worms, so they don't exist for longer than a season as a worm, and their population continues as cocoons, so as their offspring, and those cocoons are winter hardy, and that means they're protected from frost, and they're also protected actually from drought. So so worms need moisture. If there's a drought, they might die back, but their cocoons are still protected. So in addition to that, annual worms don't have to put so much energy into surviving the winter, or they don't have to have all these nifty adaptations to survive bad weather or inclement climate or something like that. As long as they can survive, a few seasons, and there's cocoons. The cocoons seem to survive longer than 1 year, so there's a cocoon bank. But all that makes them really successful invaders. They have adaptations that allows them to outcompete other things and survive really bad environments. So the other thing why they might be so invasive, we figured out that they're polyploids. Polyploidy is the possession of more than 2 chromosomes. Right? So humans are diploid, as you know. Most of us are diploid. So 2 sets of chromosomes, and for polyploids, it's more than 2 sets. And these earthworms that we're talking about right now, the snake worms, are either triploid or tetraploid or both. So one of my grad students is just doing a study right now looking at that, and what she's finding is that some worms have both triploid and tetraploid character, and most likely they're probably tetraploid because if you only see 3 alleles, there might be one that's double, so that makes it 4 again. So 4 chromosomes is probably what they have. The benefits of polyploidy is that you have more genetic information in you, right? So while you're, if you're one of these crazy snake worms and there's just one of you, and you put in the wild by some horticulturalist by mistake, then you can continue as a parthenogen. You can just keep going and make cocoons. The problem with that is, of course, that if these cocoons grow up, they are clones, and clones ordinarily don't really have anything that they can put up against the wily world out there. So if you have more than 2 chromosomes, then you have all that genetic variation within you. So a lot of plants that are weed plants are polyploids. They have 20 or 30 chromosomes, and so they have all that great genetic diversity within them. They don't have to have there can be clones because there's all this other stuff going on inside them. And so I think that is also one of the reasons why they might be successful. How can you tell them apart? So here's 12 of the 16 that exist here, and they all kind of look the same. There's this one down here, the Pithmera bicincta. That looks pretty different, right? But all the other ones, well, they're tough to distinguish. And so you have to look at minutiae look at characters on their on their skin, right? So here's what is labeled D over here. There's 3 arrows there. There's 3 little slits there. Those are places where ordinarily an earthworm would receive sperm from another earthworm. So these are called spermatheca. So places where sperm is deposited, and they differ in position and in number and in size and in shape between these 3 earthworms that are important for us. So we can actually tell without using our naked eyes what these worms are. If it wasn't for the fact that these earthworms sometimes, a lot of times, don't have all the bits and pieces. So there's morphs, so-called morphs, that don't have all the characters to understand who they are, right? So this earthworm here, the Amynthus agrestis, might only have, so it's the one on the left that's labeled D. Can you see the mouse? Okay, so this one here has 3 spermatheca, but in some cases, and it should be pairs of spermatheca, one pair on each side, so it's 3 pairs, and sometimes they only have 3 on one side, and sometimes there's only 2 pairs, and sometimes there's only 1 single spermatheca. So they have these strange morphs. There's some that resemble hermaphrodites, so morphs that could theoretically be involved in reproduction, sexual reproduction. So they have all the bits and pieces they need, but that's only 5% of the population, or even less than that. And all the other ones are, there's also some that are fully parthenogenetic, and they don't have any of the bits and pieces, which means we know those can only be producing eggs or egg casings, cocoons, without any sex at all. The theory is that none of them have sex, and they have just evolved into this parthenogenetic superbug, superworm. And we're not sure why that, I mean, there's theory that says being a parthenogen is better than being a sexually reproducing hermaphrodite, as from being able to outcompete other things. But we're not sure what the mechanism is that drives them that way. So, of course, you know, who cares? It's just earthworms. Why do we worry? And we worry because of this. So this slide is from the Boston Globe at some point and many years back. And it shows two situations in a forest. One is on the left, the one on the left-hand side where it says lightly infested. That is sort of at the beginning of the invasion. And you notice that there's a lot of greenery at the top. So there's a lot of understory material still. The soil is undulating. So there's some microtopography on that soil. And then above that, there's a layer that is known as litter and duff layer. So this is this layer here. So this is what I would call an O horizon. And so there's three parts in O horizon. There's an OI, which is the leaf litter and material that's not decomposed very much. Then below that is the OE horizon, which is where things are, you know, they are decomposed to a point where you can still tell what they might have come from, but you really can't be sure. And then below that, there's this really dark black band, which is the OA horizon, and that is highly decomposed material. And the organic matter content of those horizons is still high enough for that to be an organic horizon. So once this infestation continues, you get to something that looks like this. You once again have a dark horizon here, but this is no longer an O horizon, it's an A horizon, partly because some of the organic matter has been decomposed and is now becoming part of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and partly because some of these worms mix the mineral material with the organic material, and thereby turning this into an A horizon. So an O horizon has to have more than 20% organic matter by weight. And so if you mix that organic matter with something that doesn't have organic matter in it, you dilute the organic matter, and that makes that then a mineral horizon, and that would be an A horizon. There's a couple of other things that you notice probably, is that some of the roots of the tree are now exposed. And then so some of my friends call that tree gingivitis. And the other thing you notice is that the surface of that soil is now very straight, very flat, and that comes from the fact that that surface horizon is also compacted by now. So that A horizon is a lot more compact than that bouncy O horizon was. You know, where you walk through the forest and you have that spring in your feet because there's that bounce in the soil, which means it's not very compacted, and that makes it a really good place for roots to explore for nutrients. A, because it's easier to penetrate into that layer, and also that's where a lot of the other biological activities. So a lot of the fungi are found in there. So a lot of the decomposition happens there. It's really rich in available nutrients, and so trees and shrubs and ephemerals really love that layer. Once that's gone, you know, it's not as juicy anymore. And the other thing that duff layer does, it's also where a lot of the seeds are. So the seed bank is there, and once that goes, all that porous material goes, and you have this compacted A horizon, that top layer is no longer a seed bank. We need to know a little bit more about earthworm ecogroups. So there's three kinds of earthworms. Actually there's more than that, but three big groups. Endogenic earthworms, they are earthworms that live in the soil, but only in the top part of the soil, close to the surface. They make burrows that are horizontal. They tend to be not pigmented, so they're lighter colored than the red worms that you probably all know. And then there's epigeic worms. Those are the guys that live at the surface, usually in the leaf litter. They are pigmented, so they're darker in color. And then there's anisic earthworms that basically travel through the soil in permanent burrows, and they go to the surface to feed there and to mate there, and they do all sorts of things at the surface. But as the night crawler, they would just come up, during the night, and they will then take some of the leaf litter from the surface and drag it into their burrow, and they weld the leaf litter to the burrow walls by their feces. And so the feces are really enriched in bacteria, and so they then start to break down the leaf litter, and that becomes food for the anisic worm. So there are also worms that are so-called epi-endogenic worms, and they basically straddle the leaf litter, the O-horizon, and the leaf litter layers and the mineral soil, and those are the ones that probably do quite a bit of damage, because they mix the organic material into the A-horizon and compact the soil that way. And so it's just some examples. So the red wiggler over here is an epigeic earthworm, and that's why composting in big facilities works. You put the compost on top, and the earthworm moves right into that layer, in that top layer of fresh compostable material, and that is basically because the red wiggler wants to be at the surface. So that's why it's a good composting worm. So on the left-hand side, you see endogenic worms, and you notice that they don't really have those dark pigments, and they don't need them. One of my colleagues says, well, earthworms can also get sunburned, and so if they don't have pigments, they don't want to be in the sun. Here's a comparison between soils before and after invasion by European earthworms. On the left-hand side, you see before the invasion, and you notice how fluffy this material appears, right? So there's lots of roots going through there. If you squint at that image, you probably see some fungal hyphae as well. And then you go into the other side, you notice there might be some algal growth up here actually, and the soil is really compacted. And so that changes the nature of that forest. Just this compaction, this change from that moor type or Duff forest floor to a mull type, which is a compacted soil forest floor. So no more seed bank, no more good germination medium on the left-hand side, which means that the ephemeral is going to go, not all of them, but many of them. And then on the right-hand side, no more seed bank, no more germination medium. All the little stuff is excluded from that forest, leaving a less dense and less diverse forest vegetation. And that's really, one thing that we worry about right away. Night crawlers, by the way, they're not any better. In fact, so both night crawlers and jumping worms are basically the end point of an invasion. That's when you see most of the damage done. And so here you see a night crawler midden. So what they use to close up their burrow, and you notice this is sort of a heap here, and it usually consists of castings which are under these leaves, and they also pull leaves and needles into their midden or on top of them so that you don't see them. But if you go through a forest and I show you one, you will see them everywhere. And so if you walk around in the Champlain Valley, in the forests of the Champlain Valley, most of them are infected by night crawlers. And so once you remove the leaf litter, you notice a couple of things. First of all, there's some there's some casting material over here, some casting material over there, so small casting, large castings, and then here's that big hole that the nightcrawler makes. That's actually a pretty big hole. It's about 1/3 to 1/2 inch in diameter. So the forest soil modifications by Amynthas agrestis are very different. So you don't necessarily get that compaction, but what you get instead is a very loose layer of granular material. And that is not any better than that compaction, because that loose layer just doesn't allow roots to, the roots penetrate easily, but they don't find any foothold. I mean, they just don't make it in there. And that layer in this case, in this case here is about 5 centimeters deep, so 2 inches. It's classified as an A horizon because the organic matter is no longer really high. So for this layer here, we have organic matter content of about 10 to 12%. But if you see that this granular material anywhere, you probably have snakeworms there. Just to give you a comparison, here's the European earthworm soil. Very, very different. So the earthworms set off an ecological cascade that starts with disturbing the soil. And that in itself will change how the soil chemistry works, because of the aeration of the soil is different and the penetration of water into the soil becomes different. And that leads to depletion of the understory. There are some plants that are favored by that. For example, jack in the pulpit is favored. They accumulate calcium oxalate, which is what makes oxalis so sour. And so they're protected from browsers, which is the other thing that goes with these earthworms. So once the earthworms have depleted the understory, what is left is are woody saplings, some forbs maybe, and then those things that have adaptations to deter browsers, so that sour flavor of the calcium oxalate. So anyway, so it's greater browsing pressure on shrubs and saplings, and that will have some longer term effects on the canopy, of course, because you have less saplings. There's not going to be regeneration of the canopy species. There's also more runoff and more erosion occurring. And people have shown that there may also be more enteric pathogens, so E. coli and Salmonella there, that moves with the sediments now, that comes from deer or something like some animals, because there's more runoff and erosion now. You're also moving some of those pathogens. And then of course there's also fewer ground nesting birds, because the nest cover that was there before is now gone, and so the nests are now exposed to nest predators. So that is the comparison between a healthy forest vegetation and one that is invaded by earthworms, and you can see the difference. I don't have to say anything about that. And so this particular picture on the right is taken in a forest that is invaded by snakeworms, but you can expect something very similar to occur in a forest that's invaded by European earthworms. And then that's not the end of it, so you have invasive species coming in. So where there's opportunity, because there's no more native species, you also have maybe invasive species that take hold. And it seems that for many places where there's European earthworms, you have barberry coming in. So there's 2 places here that were in Rhode Island, and 2 places at Quechee. Near the Vince buildings, you have European earthworms. So this is right at the bottom where there is that little vernal pool. And then if you go down to the floodplain, there used to be Asian earthworms there. And there's very few now because of Irene. Before Irene, you had like 80 per square meter in the summer. And now you find maybe 1 per square meter because Irene put so much sediment into that floodplain that it really, the earthworms that were hatching weren't able to make it to the top. So the endpoints of invasion, I mentioned that there's, it's usually indicated by the presence of the nightcrawler or the snakeworm. Those two things are, if you see a lot of those, then most likely the damage to the forest is done, and you have to start thinking about how to prevent these worms from moving any further. Just to give you an idea what the regeneration of sugar and red maple saplings is, or by ferritomoids, so the snakeworms, Lumbricus terrestris, which is your nightcrawler, and where you don't have any worms at all. So you have like half a sapling on average for where there's ferritomoids. You have about 3 on average for where there is Lumbricus terrestris. And this is per square meter, I should say. And you have, where there's no earthworms, like 6 or 7. So there's a big difference. And by the way, both of these, the images on the right-hand side, both of those areas are invaded by snakeworms. And you say, whoa, look at that. There's all that greenery there, but there's only 2 species there. And those probably have some kind of defense against browsers. And the other thing is that your ferns have below ground structures from which they can grow, so that they're not reliant on seed or their spores to come back every year. So the same goes for Trillium. Has underground structures from which they can regrow, so they don't need to have that seed bank. So some things doing relatively well. And then if you look at the plant cover and species richness, for ferritomoids, you're talking about on average you find 1 species of a plant. For Lumbricus terrestris, about 3 species, and for nowworms, you're 4 or 5 species. Percent plant cover in percent. So ferritomoids really low, and then with there's no earthworm, you have about 40% cover on average. The error bars there are standard deviations, so it's not it doesn't indicate the range of what we see, it just indicates some measure of statistical dispersion. So this is the one that I always show. It's the no sapling, no maple. No maple syrup in 100 years' time, and we have to put up with all sorts of strange synthetic mapleine syrup. Anyway, more fun facts. So Darwin and earthworms, you all know about him and his earthworms, but the thing that really struck me as odd was that the formation of the vegetable mold through the action of worms in its first edition sold better than the Origin of Species in its first edition. And then there's another one, the largest worm in the world is the Gippsland giant earthworm, and it's a megascolecid, and it's 3 meters long. David Attenborough has a video on YouTube where he walks around and he listens for this worm. So there's a squelching sound when you are in its territory. There's a giant earthworm here as well. So the Palouse worm can become 1.8 meters long. And some people say that there's the South African giant earthworm that has been observed to be 6.7 meters long. But of course, an earthworm, you can stretch it and it's longer than, I think the Guinness Book of Records probably doesn't have any real rules for how long an earthworm is. So Amynthas agrestis National Parks, this is from the Great Smoky Mountains. Yeah, That's exactly what that other website was talking about. Amynthas agrestis. Composting ads boast that the worm, Amynthas agrestis, can eat and process more than its body weight in organic matter each day. If your leaf litter feeder, such as a millipede, fly larvae, and springtail, it's a problem for you, right? So that's what that website was talking about. Horticulture. Here's Cindy Hale. She was the queen of earthworms. She's now no longer in academia. She has her own farm now. But she was the go-to person 20 years ago, and she found, and this person in Pennsylvania who grew 30,000 different varieties of hostas was shocked to find out that half of or a third of his nursery was destroyed, and so they called her up, and Cindy said, "Yep, the reason for that is because you have these Asian snake worms." Here's a lady slipper plant that was killed by the earthworms by just exposing its roots. Potential vectors, horticultural waste, mulch, and I should add to this now compost. So we get a lot of calls now from people that saying, "Well, I'm sure that these worms came with compost," and in a couple of cases they said, "Well, you know, we had a couple of bags of compost left from last year, and we opened them this year. They were all sealed up, and inside we found snake worms." So the composting trade is living in total denial about that. They say, "Well, our compost piles get so hot that it kills everything." But what they don't really tell you is that the outside of that composting pile you can actually touch without burning your hands, you know. And anybody who has compost piles knows that, but the folks in the trade don't. And they come and say, "Well, it's not us, can't be, impossible." But you go to some of the compost piles that are in community gardens that are hot, and you reach in and you can get, if you go to the right place, you can get about, every time you reach in, you can get 10 of these snake worms. And you don't have to go far in, you go about 5 centimeters in where the temperature is just right for them. So compost is also a problem. If you have to use compost, use your own, make your own if you have the space. Really important. So we did some phenology work, and let's go through this a little quicker so we can all go to sleep eventually. I hope you're still awake. So you see 3 graphs here, and each graph has 3 lines in it, three different lines that correspond to different years. And I noticed that one of the symbols is not right anymore, but anyway, what you see is here, the top one is the total abundance of earthworms at one site per square meter. So you can get up to 200 per square meter. In fact, in 2019 was a year when there was a couple of weeks when we got over 400 per square meter, 400 of them per square meter in a woodland. So, anyway, so the first ones you find beginning of April and they die around about middle of November. Sometimes you can see some that have burrowed pretty deep into the soil in December, but then, mid-December, they're all gone. Most of them, 99.9% of them are gone by mid-November. And by that time, they have produced so many cocoons that they're all happy. So the other thing to look for is in this kind of curve is when do they produce, when do the adults emerge? So they emerge somewhere between the 9th of July and sometime beginning of September. Sometimes it's late, sometimes it's early. It all depends on when, what kind of spring you have. Is it warm? Is it moist? If it's warm and moist, then you have adults really early. If you go to a nursery, you probably find adults 2 or 3 weeks before you find them in the woodlands, because the conditions there are perfect, right? So they get all the moisture they want. It may not be too hot, but it's probably warmer than in a forest, because the forest has a canopy, and so it's cooler there than in the nursery. So you get much earlier emergence of adults. In a droughty year, so I want to just show you here, so we get about 90, so if we go to September, we have about 90 per square meter in a regular year. And if you look at, end of July, you probably have 120 per square meter. Now, if you go to drought years like 2016, and it was even worse last year, I'll tell you about that in a minute, you have just about 80 at the end of June. And that compares to about 120 in a regular year. And these numbers don't come back up. In 2020, by the time July came around, beginning of July, they were done. You found maybe 1 or 2 per square meter because it was so droughty. It doesn't mean that they're not back next year, because they have the ability, the cocoons have the ability to stay around for longer. So when it's really droughty, they also go into this phase where the embryo is protected and doesn't develop anymore until the drought is broken. So control of earthworms, great. So there's some hopefuls. So alfalfa meal is thought to be pretty good, says a horticulturist who uses it in Poughkeepsie. Jean has been putting me onto that. There's Beauveria bassiana, which is, if you look it up, it's Botanigard. It's the brand name. And then there's other agents. So the Beauveria bassiana is a fungus. It's an entomopathogenic fungus, and you see what happens to a caterpillar that's infected. It's just, all of this is just fungal hyphae all around that body, and so of course that caterpillar dies. We had a bioassay, and I just show you the results. So the effect of the Beauveria bassiana on juvenile snakeworms is actually pretty good. So what you see on the x-axis here are different treatments. So we have a control with water, we have a control with millet, and then this BB stands for Beauveria bassiana with 15 grams of mycotized millet. So you grew the fungus on the millet. And this one is 30 should be grams, 30 grams of Beauveria bassiana. And then there's Beauveria bassiana spray, that where you just put the spores on without growing the fungus on the millet. And you have really good numbers here. It's about 80% effective, between 70 and 80% effective if you have Beauveria bassiana, compared to 30% control with water and control with millet. So the reason why the control with water is so high at about 35% is because they don't get the millet. The millet is food for them, right? So when you control just with water, the mortality is pretty high because they don't get enough to eat. Whereas if you have control with the millet, the mortality is much lower because they have something to eat. So that's the way to look at this experiment. So Beauveria bassiana is actually pretty good in a greenhouse, or maybe even in a nursery. But you wonder whether you should really unleash this fungus in the forest, because there's obviously insects that are important for the forest. So then there's the really hardy cocoons. Now here's that picture I promised you earlier on. If you look at the left-hand side, it shows you what happens when there's a drought or when there's cold temperatures in the winter. They both have the same effect. They desiccate the cocoon, and that helps the embryo to escape damage. So in the winter time, it's probably easiest to understand. So I explain the winter one. In the winter, if you have any water in your body, and you're an embryo of these snakeworms, then there's ice crystals that form inside your body. And when that happens, your cells are disrupted, right? So you don't want that to happen. So these cocoons desiccate and the embryos desiccate. And then during the humid and warm season, the cocoons rehydrate and the embryos rehydrate, and they start to develop again. So these cocoons are really great survival structures. And I usually make a joke here about Brady, football gate, but I can't do that anymore because he's won it again. Anyway, is there a cocoon bank? This is the big question. So if we were to treat the forest, would that make any difference, right? So I'll show that picture. I want to show this first. If you use Beauveria bassiana on cocoons, there is an increased mortality rate, but it's nowhere near the mortality rate that you see in with the worms, right? So these cocoons are hardy, so they can survive really adverse conditions. And so, is there a cocoon bank? And so, when we count the number of cocoons in the spring, summer, fall, and winter, we notice that they're there all the time. They're even there in the spring and the summer. In the summer, before the worms start producing cocoons, there's still cocoons there. So, which basically means that these cocoons can last for longer. And we had an experiment in the forest where we used laundry bags, those things you use for lingerie, and we put soil in there with cocoons, and we came back and we did this 1 year, and then we came back 2 years later, and some of the cocoons were still viable. And we looked every month. We looked that there was no worm that had hatched. We removed the worms that had hatched. So those were cocoons from 2 years ago. So there's different stages of embryos. So the one that we always worry about is the one that is ready to hatch. This is the last one here on stage 5. And if you look at embryo stages through the year, so my grad student Mariam Nuriain dissected a ton of these cocoons, and she found out that there was always cocoons that were ready to hatch. And so the color for that is this medium gray is the color of the cocoons that are ready to hatch. So this gives you the percentage of developmental stages in a ton of cocoons, and so it's always up to 100. And so this basically splits it up into early stages, anything from 1 to 3, and then the ones that are ready to hatch are 4 and 5. And then there's some twins. There's actually twins in there. And then there's even conjoined twins. It's really interesting. And then there's dead embryos as well. And their numbers go up in the summer. I think that's partly because they might experience drought conditions, and some of those cocoons or those embryos don't make it. We also looked at some naturally occurring biocontrol agents. So we took some dead worms that had died prematurely in the forest. Mariam, my grad student, isolated some of the pathogens in them, and then she grew them, she cultivated them, and then she had a biocontrol experiment where she added them to little mesocosms with worms in them, and she found out that penicillium, so this is this graph here, so on the bottom you see what the treatments are, and then you see mortality on the y-axis, and within each one of these groups, for penicillium, for example, you have one. We counted the worms after 96 hours, after 144 hours, and after 240 hours. And so as time goes by, they're obviously more affected by the pathogens. But we reached with penicillium and with this particular bacillus, we don't know what bacillus it was, but it was a bacillus. We reached 100% of mortality, which is really high. And those are naturally occurring things. And I would doubt that we would ever get permission from EPA to spray the forests with any of these. You may not want to have a particular bacillus or staphylococcus sprayed on your forest. They're pathogens to humans as well. And then there's other promising agents. So T-seed extract, early bird, that is no longer available because it became apparent to some people that the use of early bird, which is a turf fertilizer, that they use that turf fertilizer off label. Basically, they use it as a pesticide, which was really what they wanted to do. So my feeling is that they probably were told not to do this anymore, so they don't have that anymore. But you can get tea seed extract, pure stuff, from some places. Alfalfa, so that seems to work. And then what we've been looking at also is dilute soap. So soap kills them really quickly. So it's also a saponin-based cure, right? And then there's some other irritants like mustard might also kill them. Same, it basically irritates the skin. They can't breathe really well anymore, and they die a horrible death. You don't want to be around when that happens. It's just horrible to watch. There's also some physical disruptors like very angular sands, so very sharp sands, and some biochars have been touted as being good agents of control. So the question is, how can you get involved, right? So you may want to know some more about that. So if you see a snakeworm, you can add it to one of the databases, because so iNaturalist, you could have done that a long while on the IMAP invasives for the Vermont version of that. That has only been possible since last year, because until last year, the snakeworms were not recognized as invasive species, but now they are. So now there's a page on IMAP invasives Vermont. So questions. I want to thank Mariam, of course, because she's doing a lot of work, and a former grad student of mine, Ryan. They both have done a lot of work on these snakeworms, and there's a lot more to report. And Ryan wrote his thesis, but then he disappeared and got himself a job, and he hasn't written it up, so I can't talk much about that. So anyway, any questions? You're all muted still, so if you want to unmute, then you can ask questions.
I'll ask something. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I have been aware of this concern for a long time. I happen to have a irrational annelid aversion, so deep-seated from childhood. So it's not something that I have, even though I spend a lot of time in the forest and on the forest floor because I'm into plants, it's been not something that I've really delved into, but I have seen some forests when I was working in New York where the whole forest floor is castings and there's almost no plant diversity. And I've been very curious about it. And in that place, it was very obvious, but I'm wondering, in Vermont, what are the chances that we walk into our neighborhood forest and dig a hole and find them? Are these invasives? And I know the answer might be different for different species, but are these really everywhere in our forest?
You can bet that there's some earthworm in most places, unless you go to elevation and really far away, sort of remote places. So even if you go up to pass roads, Smuggler's Notch, for example, is a great one to look at. Smuggler's Notch has a lot of traffic, a lot of people go there, and they have worms up there. They don't have the snake worm, but they have other earthworms there. So one of the studies that has been done in Canada was they were trying to find out what the distribution of earthworms were in Alberta, and they basically correlated the occurrence of earthworms in remote Alberta with the closeness of roads, right? So wherever there is a road going through a place, you have a chance that you find find earthworms, period. So I would say that you have a 90% chance in the Champlain Valley, if you walk into wood, to find earthworms. Now, so this in particular in deciduous places. So it's a little bit different in coniferous forests, because there the litter is not quite as palatable to these worms, and therefore they don't make it there. But as soon as you have a little bit of a mix of something else in there, like some deciduous, so a mixed hardwood or mixed coniferous forest, you'll find them, especially at the lower elevation. So if you go up to Smuggler's Notch and you hike further up, you lose the worms. If you go to Camel's Hump, there are now some pockets of earthworms on the way up to Camel's Hump from Huntington. Where that study was in the 60s, the plant study, the vegetation study. Where was I? Oh yeah. So if you go further up, the pockets are very small there, so things haven't expanded that much. That's pretty far out from traffic. As the further up you go, the fewer you find. And in fact, that forest is actually still pretty healthy looking, even though there are some earthworms there. But that's probably because it's still the beginning of the invasion.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that I saw, it was really obvious. It took me a while to realize what I was seeing, but I haven't seen anything like that in Vermont yet. So it's deceiving, to think that.
Yeah, if you come down to the Champlain Valley, you'll find them. So a lot of forests have them, and sometimes, so even if generally earthworms. I don't mean just snakeworms. So if you go to Shelburne Farms, their sugar bush is just riddled with lumbricus, so with nightcrawler middens, so heaps of soil and litter. So that's a really good example. You might find the people in Wisconsin describe a soil that is heavily damaged as a soil where you find 5 middens in a square meter. We find at Shelburne Farm, we find 40 per square meter. And that is not unusual in the Champlain Valley at all. As long as you're looking at it like a nice sugar maple stand, that you have a good chance of finding stuff. And I'm sure that down Bennington Way, you have similar things, similar situations.
Do you think it's correlated at all with the marble or the rich forest? I'm just thinking totally anecdotally, most of the places I've seen this have been in Marble Valley or highly calcareous forests. And I don't mean to hog all the questions. I'm sorry, you guys.
Yeah, so it's totally possible. And so the reason why I'm saying that is because a lot of the European earthworms, especially the nightcrawler and redworm, which do a lot of damage, thrive on calcareous soils. And the reason for that is the fact that they don't have lungs, they don't breathe the way we do. So what they do is they take some of the calcium that's in the soil and they combine it with the CO2 and they make calcite, and so they poop out calcite as part of their respiration. And sometimes you can see that in the soil. If you have a nice dark soil, sometimes you see these white glittery particles interspersed with the dark A-horizon material, and that is probably calcite that's made by the worms. And that's the European earthworm. So that the Asian earthworms don't do that, as far as we know. That in order for worms to be able to do that, they need, as far as we know, they need this thing called a calciferous gland. And the European earthworms do have that, and the Asian earthworms don't. And I'm not sure what they do with their carbonic acid that is in their stomachs.
I've actually encountered them quite a bit in the Taconics, where there's a lot of enriched sites. In Wellington,
I believe it.
I guess, and we have a property in Starksboro where we're just seeing them move up into the edge of the forest from a nearby field.
Mm-hmm.
And
these are European earthworms, most likely, right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just wish I knew something that we could use to control them, to keep them from getting up into that forest, because I've seen what they've done in Arlington and in Rupert, where it looks just like the photos that you showed. There's nothing in the understory in these beautiful, rich northern hardwood forests.
Maybe a physical barrier. You would have to put it relatively deep in the soil, but that's hard work. A little sort of fence, but that you have to put it very deep in the soil. There's not very many predators.
I was curious about the
it's really difficult.
Yeah, I was curious about the biochar and what. How is that applied?
Well, it has to be fine enough for the worms to be able to feed on it, but it cannot be so small that it just passes through the gut. So it has to be very, so that they're saying hardwood biochar, and it has to have sharp edges so that it disrupts their guts.
Okay.
So I mean that's a possibility. I mean, if you put the biochar out, then you have a chance, but you also have a chance it doesn't work. You know, I mean, what you do in the lab is not what's happening in the real world. So I would say try it out in one patch, as long as it doesn't do any harm to anything else. That's always the problem, right? So if you find something that works on the worms, it might also work on some other things that you don't want destroyed.
Right.
Yeah, I wish I could give you better advice on that. So I mean, I can give you advice on how to get rid of them when they're in compost or mulch, and you can solarize them. But for preventing an invasion from a field, across an edge of fields is very different. I mean, you can try maybe to get rid of the leaf litter on the edge and see whether that is a thing, or you might want to put a small trench there. When I was in Japan, we hardly ever found any earthworms, and there's some relevance to this. Okay, so wait me out. We hardly ever found any earthworms in the forest themselves. What we did find, where we did find them, was in little trenches that were along the road. They actually weren't trenches. They were basically channels that were concrete channels, and they all fell in there and they couldn't get out. That might be a possibility, but that costs money. If you have a big edge, then how much of that do you want to put there, and how long is that going to stay intact if it's on the edge of a field when there's farm machinery running around.
I had a question about, you had mentioned that in your compost, you have both European and snake worms.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering then, what do you do with the compost? Like, do you feel comfortable putting it on your garden beds, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the middle of a city, right? So I'm in, well, city. I'd call it a village from where I'm come from, but I'm in St. Albans, and I'm in a neighborhood that's already riddled with the snake worm. So I have no qualms putting it out. I have seen a little bit of damage to my garden that I attribute to the worms, but that's only because I'm very suspicious of them, and I don't really have any real I don't have any real proof, right? So all I know is that a couple of years back, when I had a lot of these snake worms, my aubergines just didn't stay in the ground. It's basically you could touch them and they would fly up in the air, because they didn't root very well at all.
Huh.
And I think that was because they were trying to root into these castings that are very loose. So I mean, one thing that I was hoping I could get across to you is everybody is hacking on those snake worms, but the European worms do as much damage, just different kind of damage. But it comes down to the very same thing. The same cascade of ecological events is set off by that alteration of the soil. There might be two different kinds of soils, two different kinds of humus forms that are being formed by the worms, but they're both culminate in the same thing. You know, less biodiversity, less cover, a lot more opportunity for nest robbers to go after ovenbird nests or whatever else is ground nesting. So, and I personally think that they also have an effect on water quality. You know, just think about the folks that did buffer research and forest research in the 80s and 90s. They said, you know what, forests are great. They're great sinks for nitrogen and phosphorus and all sorts of other things. And now you have these worms that can mobilize heavy metals. You have the worms create surfaces that are more erodible, and they generate very quickly a lot of mobile nutrients. So, you know, phosphate and nitrate and stuff like that will probably reach groundwater. And nobody really knows what's going on there, and you know, nobody wants to know. You know, so I've been writing grants on this for forever, and they say, "Oh, that's not important. That's not important. That's not important." But if you really look at this, the scale of the damage that's done in Vermont forests and anywhere else in the Northeast, and stretching into the Midwest, into those forests, you must wonder. There's serious acreage that's being damaged, and nobody cares. Nobody wants to know. You know, earthworms, not a problem. So I don't know. We keep at it and find out. So that's yet another worry, right? I mean, another worry is it's not just the integrity of the forest, but also what happens to the water resources that they might affect. So I know. So I've run a few experiments on erosion, and I know that the earthworms are. The snake worms in particular cause more or make the soil more erodible, I should say. So one thing that is good about forest soils is that they're somewhat protected from erosion because there's a canopy in the summer, and in the fall there's leaf litter on the ground, right? So what I'm saying, the soil is more erodible in the lab, but when you look at in the real world, you have things that reduce the rainfall energy and therefore reduce the amount of erosion that you might get in a forest. But all bets are off if you're cutting the forest and you're leaving large patches of the forest open to rainfall, then you might actually get quite a bit of erosion from that, especially when people remove the slash. So what else can I say? More questions? Go and get yourself a cup of coffee. It wakes you up.
Hi, I'm on the phone.
Okay,
Can you hear
I can't
me?
see you. That's good.
Right. You can't see me, but you and I have communicated actually. This is Olga from Bellows Falls, and we.
Hi,
emailed.
Olga.
Hi, Professor. It's good to hear your voice.
You too.
So, you know, I just went through an entire summer of being completely aware of my snakeworm situation here, and really like being, you know, having my garden be a total science experiment. And because it was a drought year, there were far fewer of them. However, I did spend a lot of time manually killing them last year in the fall, once I tuned into what was going on. And then I killed, I'm sorry to everyone, and it is really a huge karmic load. I'm not happy about it. But during the spring, I had a situation where there was road construction. They were replacing the mains. They were digging up the road, and there was a lot of cementitious material that was both dug up and then laid back down. And there were trenches, but you were talking about trenches, and there were trenches with a lot of leaves that collected. And what I observed was, it's not so much that they fell into these trenches, but they sought them out. The worms actually sought out these trenches because they were the coolest areas and the moistest and had a lot of leaf matter. There was also quite a number of other critters that liked that environment. So redback salamanders, those black beetles, millipedes.
Yeah.
And,
So
yeah.
that might be something for Peter to think about, a kind of a trap for the worms.
Yes, it was a really interesting environment because those trenches were created by this construction. And I also wonder, because this construction was going on for 2 entire summers, so there was a lot of vibration going on constantly. And I wonder if that had anything to do with just the amount of earthworms that exploded last year. Of course, last year was not this past summer, but 2 summers ago, it was a much wetter year, like completely different year than this year.
Yeah.
But in spring, I was going out there in the spring aware that I only had a very limited amount of time before they turned into adults. And I was killing like up to, I mean, it would be like hundreds every day. Yes, yes.
And you did the right thing there. You went there before they became adults. That's excellent.
That's right. And I was able to observe them as they matured, and I was able to watch the clitellum develop on some of them as they were maturing. And, you know, at the beginning, you can't really tell if the earthworm from the snakeworm when they're quite young. However, that early in the season, if I saw an adult, I now realize that I was looking at an earthworm. And the earthworms, I mean, they're just so much, they're so much nicer. They move so much slower. They're just like really pleasant in the hand. They're not aggressive and extremely fast. But so I found them to be much more attracted to cementitious calcareous material. And I have a focus on a native garden. So a lot of my plants are acid loving plants. So I was concerned about that. And I was also getting topsoil, essentially soil with the least amount of nutrient in it, and laying it on top of the thick layer of castings that I have, just to weigh the soil down, because I'm in a very hilly area. And I know that there are tons and tons. I can now walk around and recognize what the soil structure looks like if it has castings or not on them. And so like the town forest, like I've been talking to people and I've been trying to raise awareness, and it's really, really difficult, of course, for all the reasons that you mentioned, because earthworms are great. I talked to permaculture people about it, and I've talked to a permaculture person in Ithaca who actually had snakeworms, kind of observed them, didn't think they were such a huge problem, and he uses a lot of biochar. And I think that maybe the biochar that he's using, again, no proof, might be mitigating the snakeworms. But what he is doing, and this is something to think about in terms of people's gardens, is he's just and this is a very permaculture approach. He's decided to just use the area where there were a lot of worm activity and a lot of castings, and plant the kind of plants that want that kind of nutrition. So like elderberries, for instance, and currants, and so not eggplants that need to be staked, but thick stemmed, you know, shrub kind of plants that would be able to produce a strong enough root system and a strong enough trunk system that can withstand friable soil, and yet would really love that kind of highly nutritious environment. So that's like one part of it, and that's what I'm thinking I'm going to do in some of the areas, because there are areas I kind of have like these 2 hills on either side of me that are forested. They're deciduous. They have a lot of hemlock and a lot of deciduous trees, and there are areas that are like a foot or 2 of just plain castings, like amazing amount, thick like I could just run my fingers through this through like a bag of, like I would buy a bag of worm castings from the store. It would be that. And so my question actually is mycelium and mycelial structure in the soil. Like, how do the worms affect the mycelial structure? Are they eating it? Are they
That's a good
eating the
question.
mycelium?
So there's only been
Yeah.
one publication on that where somebody claims that the mycelium is being eaten by the worm. And
Right.
then there's a lot of people say, well, that might just be inadvertently consumed, but it will affect the mycelium for sure, because if you look at those castings, you don't see any fungal hyphae in there at all. You know, it's
Right.
and I think that's so when they're converting the forest floor into these castings, basically they're excluding a lot of the fungi. So so that can have an effect on plants that require mycorrhizae, right? So if you have
Right. Huge effect. That would be a huge effect on the forest.
Yeah,
Because,
So
because that's their communication network. You know, I have an area, so I have a garden path that I put wood chips down, and so I'm able to observe what's going on there. I really, the most effective way for me to get rid of them is to just dig through and manually pull them out. I've tried the mustard, and it didn't really work for me. And it's like, I kind of don't want to harm any of the other critters, because like I said, I do find the redback salamanders are in exactly the same places that the worms are in. And that is like in between crevices, in between stones, you know, and so in this, yeah, because I know they're the same kind of creatures. They like the same kind of environment, and I don't want to harm any of the salamanders and the millipedes. I'm so glad they're still here. Anyway, I have these paths with wood chips that are filled with mycelium, and also beginning to get filled with castings, but like not so much. And I think that's only due to the fact that it's a sunny area, because that's a huge aspect of, you know, where I'm in a crotch, so I'm in like sort of like a cooler, wetter, moister area. But in the sunny part of my garden, there's very few of them. They're starting to move into that area. And so like this year I followed your advice, and it was rough when you said, don't use any mulch. And I removed all the mulch, I removed all the leaves, and it was a very dry year, and it was crazy. But it was a good experiment. And, you know, there's a town forest here, and when I speak to other people and I make them aware of what this thing is, they say, oh yeah, I've seen that, and there's a lot of them around the reservoir. But when I walk around in the town forest and I look for them, I don't see them. So it's really interesting that they're really heavily present in this area, and yet they're still not in the forest, thankfully. Yeah, I don't know. It's just a matter of time, I guess.
Might be a pH question. There might be other things in the soil that prevents them from getting in there. But Olga, we should maybe talk about at some point about maybe giving a talk to your library.
Right. Well, we were going to, right? We had a date scheduled and everything, and then pandemic.
And COVID hit us. So
COVID hit us. The pH question is really, really interesting, and because that's something that as a human beings we can affect it. I mean, not in the forest, but in our own environments. Yeah. I can start that conversation again for sure, because then it could be a Zoom thing, right?
Yeah, it could be a Zoom thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Talk to the librarian. Maybe she can.
I will.
Great. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much, Josef, for this really interesting presentation and for answering all of our questions.
My pleasure.